All right, we're here with Bob O'Connor, the author of Jeep Show. So to start off, Bob, why don't you give us a brief description of your life, your biography, how you got to here, and I guess what prompted you to write this novel.
Happy to, and thanks for letting me on the show and to talk to you and your listeners. My trade was marketing and advertising for many, many years. I started writing books in about 2016. I went through a tough period in my life and just started writing notes to myself about how I got into that trouble and how I was going to get out of it. And it became a nonfiction self-help book called Gumption Aid. After that, I was going to write another nonfiction book about a circus, a real circus. And I happened to locate the daughter of the promoter of the circus. He was long gone. And she told me about his post-World War II experience as a circus promoter and as an entrepreneur. And she said, by the way, did you know that my father was an enlisted entertainer in World War II? And I said, of course, I didn't know that. And I didn't even know there were enlisted entertainers in World War II. And she said, oh, yes, military occupation specialty 442. These entertainment specialists did Jeep shows for frontline combat infantry in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go. And I said, wow, that's fascinating. And she said, by the way, his in his Jeep Show squad was Mickey Rooney. And of course, Mickey Rooney was the number one Hollywood box office attraction in 1939 and 1940 before he joined the Army in World War II. And I said, wow, that's amazing. How could I learn more about your father and his work with Mickey Rooney and these Jeep shows? And she said, well, my father's sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter that he wrote home from the European theater of operations in World War II. And we have published them in a book. So I bought that book and I had something like 100 letters, primary source material. And I also found the Army's manual from 1944 for the Morale Corps, which was the name of the service these soldiers were in. So I had a lot of primary source material, and I knew I wanted to write about this. By the way, I have talked to many, many World War II historians and World War II buffs, and I have not yet run across a person that is aware of these enlisted entertainers in World War II. So I think it's a subject that hasn't been covered. I decided to write fiction because I wanted to involve the protagonist in the Battle of the Bulge, which was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army in December and January of 1944. So that was the start of Jeep Show, and 7 short years later, here it is.
So it does seem like you would have had to research a lot of this just from all the German you use in the book, the
Yeah,
Yiddish,
yeah,
some of the lingo. And can you talk us through some of the research that was involved in
yeah,
the book, and then kind of
yeah.
how you chose to use Jim Tanser as the main character?
Well, I'll take that question backwards from you, if you please. I knew he was going to be the main character because he was this protagonist, this fictional protagonist, was inspired by this real person whose name was Jim Hetzer, by the way, German name, ironically. So I knew that this, and I knew about his life and his experiences in World War II. So I knew that he was going to be the protagonist. On research, for me, research is fun and writing is hard. So the research part of it was the research part of it was really fun. I read several books about the Battle of the Bulge, from the overview 30,000 foot level to books about individual units that were in the battle on a company size basis. So I was well versed in that. I read a brilliant overview of the United States Army in World War II. I also watched movies from the time to pick up some of the slang and dialect. I read some of the famous detective novels of the late 30s, The Maltese Falcon and a few others, and also watched movies to pick up some of the dialect. And I watched Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers is an excellent miniseries. And as it happens, Band of Brothers, of course, those 101st Airborne soldiers were in the defense of Bastogne, the famous defense of Bastogne. Well, these in Bastogne, they also had, and this is not well known, a group of soldiers called Snafu, the Snafu team, situation normal, all effed up. And these were soldiers that had retreated from frontline positions that were being overrun by the Germans. These were soldiers who were rear echelon mechanics, barbers, band members. And then in the book, one entertainment soldier by the name of Jim Tanzer is also in Team Snafu. So I watched Band of Brothers. You're probably familiar also. Ken Burns did a documentary called The War, and it is really, really excellent in focusing on the individual experience of several soldiers. So, I watched that and took a lot of notes, borrowed ideas from all of these things, changed them around a little bit. But for example, not to give away too much, but there is a moment when the main character's family gets a telegram about him that he has been killed in action. It turns out to be a mistake. I got that idea from a soldier who was interviewed in the Ken Burns documentary, who was in the Philippines, and his family also received a mistaken telegram. So I borrowed and worked a lot of things from my research, but the research was very comprehensive, and in fact, I over-researched the book. Which is a great way to procrastinate, is doing too much research. So I wrote a long chapter about Billy Sunday, the famous evangelist, and the tent revival that the main character goes to in 1929. And I wrote a long chapter about a vaudeville show that the main character sees, and several other long chapters because I had done all this research. And my editor said, you just can't do this to your readers. You can't take them away from Jim's story, to have 40 pages on Billy Sunday. So the research was fairly comprehensive. The book, even though it is fiction, it follows actual events and is factually very accurate. And I also put in a few Easter eggs for the World War II buffs, like the existence of something called M1 thumb, which is what happens when a soldier gets his thumb caught in the bolt of his M1 Garand rifle. And I didn't mention it by name, but I had the main character looking down at his bruised thumb and shaking his head. And the World War II buffs just love Easter eggs like that. And I had a lot of them.
Sure. I mean, for someone that doesn't really know Battle of the Bulge, I mean, I read the book, but
Yeah.
can you kind of give an overview of why that area of Europe, like strategically, was important and why that battle took place there?
Yeah, well, strategically, that area of Europe, which is essentially just west of Germany. So we're talking about
Luxembourg.
Eastern Holland, we're talking about all of Luxembourg because it's not that big, and even, Eastern Northern Belgium. Well, that area is next to Germany and on the way to France. So the Romans fought the German savages, 2000, had many, many battles with the German savages in the Ardennes 2000, 2,500 years ago. In World War One, the Germans came through the Ardennes and swept through Belgium, in particular, on their way to France. In World War II, Hitler overwhelming the German army overwhelmed the French army, which took the whole world by surprise in 1939, again attacking through the Ardennes, which is unlikely territory. It's very forested, very hilly, not very good country for movement. So when Hitler decided, the war was not going well for the Germans by early 1944, but especially after the Allied landings in Normandy on D-Day, which was in June of 44, Hitler essentially cooked up a mad plan, which was to again attack west through the Ardennes and circle up to Holland and divide the Allied armies, the Americans and the British, in two, and circle up to Holland and capture the main port in Holland, and then kind of make peace with the theoretically disoriented, confused Americans and British, so he could turn his complete attention to the Russians. Uh, this was a mad gamble, very unlikely to succeed. His generals were against the plan, but nonetheless, they followed his orders. So in mid-December of 1944, the Germans attacked about 200,000 German troops with 1,000 tanks, and they were three German armies: the Sixth Panzer, the Fifth Panzer, and the Seventh Army, and they attacked along about 100-mile front that was Belgium and Luxembourg mostly. And the Americans were caught completely by surprise, which is somewhat unusual. The Americans on the ground at the border thought that something was going on, but when they forwarded their they're hearing motor noise, civilians are reporting a troop buildup, and they forwarded these pieces of intelligence up the line, but somehow the top intelligence officers never put it together. The Americans were stretched pretty thin along that 70-mile front. There were three American divisions, and the Germans attacked in force, had complete surprise. Nonetheless, there was significant resistance by the Americans in the north shoulder and the south shoulder of the attack, and the Germans made a lot of progress right in the middle for about a week. And that's where I stuck the main character. He gets stranded in a town called Hosingen, Luxembourg, which is right on the border with Germany. And they're doing a show for Company K of the 28th Infantry Division in Hosingen. And the main character gets stuck there for the night. And he's woken the next morning by the German artillery bombardment and the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. So I chose that area because it was such a significant battle. As I said, the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army, but also the end of any German significant activity in the West. They continued to defend tenaciously, but they never again made an attack heading west. So it was kind of, in ways, a significant turning point in Western Europe. Although it was clear that the war had turned against Germany. By then, it was clear the war had turned against Germany. So again, as I said, it was kind of a desperate gamble, and was probably never going to pay off, but it did not.
Wayne, just the push through the middle is why it's called the bulge, correct?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They made I think about a 25-mile bulge
In line.
in the
Okay.
American line, yes, and eventually surrounded Bastogne. And we've all heard of Bastogne. The reason Bastogne, and the reason I stuck my character in Bastogne during the siege is the Ardennes was terrible country for tanks, muddy, foresty. You had to stay on the roads with a tank, and the German tanks were very heavy. So there was no chance that they could go across the roads on these fields. Well, Bastogne had seven roads coming in and out. It was a crossroads, and seven roads were going through Bastogne. So the Germans really had to have Bastogne if they were going to succeed. So yes, that was where the bulge was right up to Bastogne.
Wait, they needed it because of the infrastructure for the tanks?
They needed it because of the roads. Yes,
Okay.
they needed it because of the roads. Without Bastogne, it took too much time to reach their objectives. Their first objective was the River Meuse, which they never reached. And in fact, one thing I try to portray in the book, in story form, is the Americans during the initial week or so of the battle were just fighting to buy time. They were fighting to delay the German armies enough so that reinforcements could come up from the south, where that was General George Patton in the American Third Army was coming up from the south of France. So the Americans who were involved in fighting in the first week or so were just buying time, and many men and much equipment was sacrificed to buy time.
I guess just as sort of an offhand comment, but like as
Yeah,
I was reading this and you're describing the Jeep shows, it sort of it made me think about the first Captain America movie in like 2000 and I think like 10, where they're kind of he's kind of on the front line just doing plays, sort of for I guess morale or for entertainment for the
yeah,
soldiers, more or less like what you've described as these Jeep shows. So I did think I did I that was the picture that was
yeah.
going through my head as I was reading this. But I guess just sort of as a tangent, were these prevalent in the Pacific Ocean, like in that front of the war? Did they have these going on as well?
There were indeed enlisted entertainers, and the reason I know that is I have seen a picture of a famous comedian from the 50s and 60s named Danny Kaye. And I have seen a picture of Danny Kaye, who was enlisted, was a private in the Army, entertaining troops in the Pacific. Now, it wouldn't have been Jeep shows in the Pacific. It would have been, I guess, PT boat shows,
Boat shows.
because
Yeah.
the troops were dispersed over so many islands. But so there was the same kind of frontline entertainment going on because, as I think I said, the USO, which is sort of the famous, and wartime entertainer, and Bob Hope and all the great work he did, they were not allowed to go to the front. That was a civilian organization, and the Army did not allow civilians to go anywhere near the front lines. So whether it was in the Pacific or in Europe, the frontline entertainment was provided by these enlisted entertainers.
I guess one thought I had in the middle of the book, I can't remember if this was just Jim in his head, but he's
Yeah.
kind of talking about America having a shared purpose. They're spending like $5 billion a month, and some of the taxpayers are unconvinced, but he's saying there is some sense of shared purpose. What do you? And I feel like in today's day and age, Americans are kind of longing for a purpose
Yeah.
of being an American. Like, what do you think? Like, what could be like our new shared purpose as America?
Well, there's nothing like being attacked by a foreign by a foreign adversary. Before Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, up until then, America was divided, not as antagonistically as we're divided now, but there were many, many people in America before then who thought, this is Europe's problem. We went over and helped them out in World War I. Things turned out badly. We're not going back. But after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked American soil and killed 2,000 American sailors, all that went away. And so there was a very much a shared sense of purpose. There was also, I think, more in the late 1930s, early 1940s, there were so many immigrants and children of immigrants who were so grateful for the life that they had found in the United States. They were Jews from Eastern Europe or Russia who had suffered, for centuries in Europe. They were, poor people from Ireland, poor farmers from Ireland, like my ancestors. They were, and so the sense of America is the best place, and America is worth fighting for. Um, I think was more widely felt then than it is now. I think we tend to, as success it brings its own set of problems, and I think we tend to take things for granted now that people did not take for granted back then.
Well, I think near the end, you sort of bring up uh, the point of when they're taking pictures of the concentration camp, of the statement of people may not know what we're fighting for, but we sure know what we're fighting against. When
Yeah,
he's like
yeah,
photographing like
yeah,
the death camps, I think that's also, I don't know. I guess I feel like that would also be an equally maybe motivating.
yeah. Good,
Uh,
good point. And that was, we were not aware of the mass murder extermination program being carried on by the Germans. So when these, and then the Russians actually liberated a few of the larger camps first, but the Russians never told anybody anything. They just didn't trust anybody with any information. So when the Americans started to liberate concentration camps, the Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower toured the first one, which is in the book, and he is the one saying, yes, at least we know what we're fighting against, because he was reacting to some idea that some Americans were like, why are we fighting the Germans? Well, don't understand why we're fighting the Germans. So yes, he was reacting to that, and uh, it was very difficult for people to believe, even after it was filmed. The death camps were filmed, and we show a filming going on in that chapter. It was very difficult for people to believe that it actually happened because it was so unimaginably evil. So yes, that was also something that kind of brought people together.
I guess my next question would be, what do you think your next book's going to be?
Oh, thanks for asking. This book ends in 1946 with the protagonist who is put in occupied Germany. And the reason he's in occupied Germany is, we had something like, oh, I don't know, 9 million soldiers over in Europe and another 7 million all over the Pacific. And the war ended fairly quickly. The Germans surrendered, I believe, in May, and then the Japanese surrendered in August. And it took about 2 years to get everybody home. So the book ends in 1946 when Jim Tanzer is getting home. I would like to write a sequel, and I would like Jim to go to college on the GI Bill. Some of your listeners may know, some of them may not, but Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights in late 1944, and basically it helped GIs buy homes, but it also paid virtually 100% of the cost for veterans to go to college or trade school. And the program was an incredible success. Many more veterans took advantage of it than was planned. And it changed the social fabric. So I'll give you a personal example. My dad grew up in a working class Irish Catholic family in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was, when he came home from the war in Europe, he went to Yale on the GI Bill. Now he says he was a bit of a fish out of water at Yale, but he graduated and got his degree. And then he was a financial person, had a white collar job for his working life and sent all his children to college. Multiply that by, 8 or 9 million families, and you have changed the social fabric of America. I'm very interested in learning about that. I think it'll make me feel closer to my dad. So I'm going to write about the period. I'm going to do a sequel, and it's going to cover 1947 to 1953. There is also something called the Korean War, which ran from 51 to 53. And I don't know how the story's going to unfold. I get to do a lot of research on that, but he may be over in Korea at some point as well. So it's all in the very much planning stages right now, but I've got a few ideas.
Can you just touch a little bit on, I think, I mean, you place a large emphasis on like morale, and,
Yeah,
like, I guess keeping morale high. And it
yeah,
seems like your first book also focused on that. Can you
yeah,
just, I guess, touch a little bit on, I guess, why you felt the need maybe to write about that and
yeah.
why you think it's important?
Well, as I said, I went through a tough patch in my own life. Almost all of us do. I went through a tough patch in my own life and kind of ran out of morale. And then, when I got better, I sat down and thought about it and wrote that first book about it. And then, as we've talked about, I stumbled across the story of these real people who were soldiers in the morale corps in the army in World War II. And so, once I heard that there had been a morale corps, I was deeply interested in researching it and writing about it. And what I found is that most of the soldiers that were in combat, and combat soldiers were only about 10 to 12% of all the soldiers. So the rest were logistics and support. But for the combat soldiers, um, they appreciated these Jeep shows very much, not just for the fact that, it was entertainment and a change from their, routine, which was either really boring or really terrifying, one or the other. But they also appreciate, and by the way, if Mickey Rooney does a show for you and your platoon, that's a pretty good, show. But what they appreciated that I hadn't really understood was just the fact that these entertainment soldiers were present at the front lines, the fact that they had gone there and been present. And when I think about, you know, people going through hard times, let's say your best friend gets a divorce, or his one of his parents dies, or his dog dies, who knows, goes through a tough time. The way we best support people is not coming up with all the ideas about what they need to do next, not coming up with all this great advice, but just being present, just hanging out with them, just being present. And that's what interested me about how the frontline soldiers reacted to the Jeep show. It was the being present as much as the show. I also learned that, in the end, these combat soldiers were not fighting to really vanquish the evil German or Japanese empires, although, they kind of were, and they were not fighting for the grand ideas of spreading democracy throughout the world. When you ask them, what they would tell you and the way they acted is they were fighting for each other. They were fighting for their buddies, the guys they knew in their platoon, in their squads. And that to me is a fundamental lesson about morale, and how to gain morale and keep morale is, you you fight for your buddies. You do things for your friends. You do things for your friends. You serve others. You 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 know work for something more than just yourself. So I became fascinated with the topic of morale and wanted to learn about what it was like for these frontline combat soldiers.
I mean, kind of going back to like purpose, because like the morale, like yeah, like building community builds morale, but it would be nice if we didn't have to face an existential threat to like build the
Right,
community. So
right.
like, how do you kind of view like building community in general without some existential threat?
I think, yeah, I think what we want to do, and let's say that we want to build community where people that are really right wing, and people that are really left wing, somebody, let's say I'm really, right wing person and I want to build community with people that are on the left wing because I decide, I want to get out of my echo chamber and, just, well, you spend time with them. You're present with them. You spend time with them. You talk with them. You learn about their life. You find out that yeah, we disagree about politics, but on the other hand, man, we're both huge Arsenal supporters, or we both love gardening. So it is spending time with people that are outside of your particular bubble, and that's why you know, things like softball teams at work or church groups, or, community cleanup things or, a good bar and grill, in your neighborhood. That's how we do it. And the more we retreat into our news bubble and the more we select only for people that agree with us, the harder it is to pull together. But I will say, again, you get a natural disaster, if there's a tornado goes through your neighborhood, you're going to help your neighbor, no matter what her politics is or the fact that her dog barks all night or whatever. So there is that, but it is good preparation if we can understand each other beforehand. And the only way to do that is to spend time together.
I guess would you I guess on that note,
Yeah,
uh I feel like today things have become so polarized. Like I see often a lot of people essentially saying like I will not speak to you if you like they're not even
yeah,
willing to engage in like what you're describing because
yeah,
I think you're right. Like if you just spend time with the other person,
right.
like everything would be fine. But it's like, how do you get past that initial barrier of like getting the people to actually engage?
You know, I guess you look for shared interests and opportunities. It could be like there's nothing like two people with opposite political views or economic. There's nothing like watching the Minnesota Vikings play football together, in a bar. There's nothing like a shared interest. So I guess you look for the shared interests. In some ways, though, we've got a fever going on, in our country right now, a fever of partisanship and division, and you kind of just have to wait for it to break.
Do you have any thoughts on like when that's going to happen?
I'm a writer, not first of all,
This is taking
fu-
a weird turn, but
yeah,
now I'm curious.
future predictions are difficult. So I guess what I would say is it'll happen when there's something that reminds us, we're all on the same team here. Could be and the pandemic we had should have done that. So yeah, and instead.
It was the opposite.
Weirdly, yes,
Yeah.
weirdly, it was the opposite. I have opinions as to why, but so yeah, I don't know, and frankly, I guess from my standpoint, I'll just do what I can do, which is get to know my neighbor, stay in close communications with my older sister who's got nutty politics and we don't, we don't talk about it because there's no point. We talk about grandchildren and sports and, that kind of thing. So I don't know when it will break, but I know it will break. And I also, as a student of history, it seems like we're more divided now than, we've ever been, but we're not. We're not. Even after World War II, which was such a success for America and the American economy absolutely boomed, there was a huge Red Scare, and there was a huge fervor over rooting out communists everywhere, and it was very divisive, and so there have been times in the past, and I think there will be times in the future. Uh, but I can't say when this fever will break, but I think it will.
I guess my last question related to the book would be
Yeah.
like, what would be like something you want the reader to be able to anticipate taking away from reading the book?
I think the most important thing I would want, if I could have the reader take away, it is that understanding that the American Army in World War II was citizen soldiers. Unlike the Russian army, the German army, even the British army with their class structure, the American army was citizen soldiers. These guys voted. Their parents or their wives wrote letters to their congressmen complaining about whatever, and they, these guys were skeptical of their officers. Some officers they really respected, other officers they didn't respect. They were very skeptical of the military hierarchy, which they called chicken shit. All this BS that some of the officers put them through, and in the end, these were citizens before they were soldiers, and yet when they had to fight, they fought, and they fought well, and some of them were wounded, and some of them died. And they looked back on their service. They were glad to get out of the army, and they never wore their uniform. The day they got out of the army, and this is like my dad, he put his uniform away and he never took it out again. He was happy to be, back in civilian clothes. But like my dad, they did look back on their service in World War II as the ennobling experience of their lives. And I want the reader to take away from following the story of this ordinary man, this entertainment soldier who gets caught up in the Battle of the Bulge, has kind of a stumbling fighting retreat, uh, you know, to Bastogne, turns and fights when he has to. I want people to take away just, that understanding of what it must have been like to be in the army in World War II. Thanks for asking. It's a good question.
Sorry, can you clarify? So I'm assuming when you say citizen soldier, you mean like they volunteered, but like what exactly were the British soldiers? Were they
Well,
just
the British, so when I say citizen soldiers, I don't mean they volunteered, although many did. Most were drafted. Uh, and the army was larger than the Navy, the Marines, and the Army Air Force combined. So the army actually had to depend on the draft to fill its ranks. So the army reflected America as a whole, much more than the other services. When I say the British Army weren't citizen soldiers, of course, Britain was a democracy and, they voted as well. But the British class structure was, it still exists, but it was so rigid then that the idea of officers commanding enlisted men was completely understood and accepted in the British Army, whereas in the American Army, you know, they graded at the officer class quite a bit because we didn't have that class structure in America. So that's what I meant by,
so more of
uh,
a hierarchy and just how they view authority
Yeah,
almost.
much more accepted in Britain, especially, in the middle, still in the middle of the 20th century, much more accepted than with Americans.
Okay. I guess my last question is just sort of a
Yeah.
general question. You've talked, I mean, you've talked a lot. It seems like you've done a real lot of research into this time period. I guess can you just go over like your general like writing process of how you organized all the data and put it all
Yeah.
down?
Yeah. As I said, I over researched and that was tremendous fun. I as as I was doing it, I got a structure of the book in mind. So I kind of wrote out the 20 or so chapters and when it would start for the protagonist and when and where it would end. And then I use a simple list making software online called Workflowy, and it just allows you to make lists with subcategories. So I then started, I had taken notes, voluminous notes from my research, and I just started arranging it under the chapters. Um, and just kept probably for 3 years just started writing those chapters and rewriting them uh, specific tactical things uh, when I'm doing my writing job correctly. I get up, I get up around 6 in the morning. I drink 2 cups of coffee, have a piece of toast, and sit down and write for a couple of hours. I don't open my phone and look at email. I don't listen to the news. I don't do anything until I've gotten that writing out of the way because I find that if you do anything else, it's distracting and takes away from the imagination. So that was my process. I would it took a long time. I think I learned a few things. One of which is to not do too much research before you've worked out the structure of the book, because if you do that, there's a lot of things that you learn a lot about that don't end up in the book. But that was my overall process.
Do you go for a word count every morning, or you just strict like 2 hours and then
Yeah,
kind of?
good question. I lots of writers, lots of excellent writers do a word count. For me, I just did like 2.5 to 3 hours until I was like, I can't do this anymore. I have to go for a walk or, do laundry or, clean the floor or something. So for me, it was more 2.5, 3 hours was all I had in me.
Cool.
Um, and sometimes it would be, 1,000 words. Sometimes it would be more. Sometimes it would be less. And sometimes I'd be going back and remembering like, oh, wait a minute, you left him in Paris, and now you're talking, and now you're having him magically appear in Berlin. You can't do that, So there was some of that as well.
Cool. Well, Bob, it's been great having you on. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can go get the book? And why don't you also tell us about the nonprofit organization that serves veterans
Yes.
that you have going too?
Yeah, I'll start with that. It's more important. There's a startup nonprofit serving veterans called Shields and Stripes, and they serve veterans and first responders who need both mental health help, but also physical. It's an integrated 6 to 8 week program, really, really special. Um, and I met these guys and was so impressed, and I told them that I would give them $1 per copy sold of Jeep Show, and so far, and I am doing that. Uh, it is funny though. I said I would give you all the profits from the sale of Jeep Show, but $1 per copy will be way, way, way more money. Um, so my goal is to sell 100,000 copies and give those guys 100,000 so they can, really amp up their facility. We'll see. The book is available on Amazon. Just enter Jeep Show book in the search box. And if you don't like Amazon, it's available on bookstore.org. Um, obviously, it's in print, paperback, it's in an audio book. And I have to tell you, if you write a book and you think you've got it all corrected and you want to find out all your typos that you missed, you get an actor to record your audiobook to read it out loud, and you sit in the studio watching him and drinking coffee and chewing gum or whatever. And about every 10 pages, he looks up and he says, Bob, did you mean to repeat this word twice? Or, he looks up and says, Bob, this doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, oh, yeah, Max, you're right. I'm going to circle that. Just keep going. I'm going to circle that in red pen. So, anyways, there's a very good audio book because a very talented actor did it. And the reason there's no typos in the paperback is because a very talented actor read the book to me, every word of it. And then, of course, it's in an ebook as well. So it's whatever way you want it. There's a website called jeepshowbook.com if you want to see some video, or if anyone wants to reach out to me with questions. I've gotten some questions and comments from veterans, more recent veterans, and just means the world to me. Just means the world to me. So that's that's how you get the book. That's how you contact me. And gosh, it's been great to talk to you guys about the book. And I'm really grateful to you all for reading it and asking great questions.
So Bob, what is the best email for people to reach out to you to?
Roberto, Roberto, at okpi.com. That's my little company. O is in O'Connor, K is in Kit Kat, P as in partner, I is in incorporated. Roberto at okpi.com. Yeah, let me know. I'd love to hear from your listeners.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you. It was a good book. Jack, do you know what we're doing next?
The next book up is one of the books you picked, Al. I believe it's Steal Like an Artist.
Artist. Yeah. I
I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
think it's Cleon Austin Steele like an artist.
Seen it. Seen it.
Oh yeah. Marketing. All right.
So
Well,
with that said, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. As always, I'm Jack Allwile, and with me also, as always, is my brother Alex Allwile. Al, it's been a great episode. And Bob, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
thanks, guys.